Welcome back to Cornwall Insight's Energy Essentials podcast. Today, we will be discussing what we can expect from Allocation Round 7 of the Contracts for Difference scheme, following the publication of the indicative timeline and a number of consultations on proposed changes to the scheme. I'm Robin Clarke, an analyst here at Cornwall Insight, and I'm joined by my colleagues Tim Dixon and Lucy Dolton, who I'll let introduce themselves now, starting with yourself, Tim.
Hi everyone, I'm Tim Dixon, a senior consultant at Cornwall Insight. I've been at the company coming up to 10 years now, focusing on many of our low carbon consulting services.
And Lucy?
Hi there, everyone. Yep, I'm Lucy Dolton. I'm the Assets and Infrastructure Manager at Cornwall Insight, and I've previously held subject matter expertise roles looking at low carbon generation, very similar to Tim. I've been with the company for about 6 years and now operate in this team manager function.
Thanks both, and great to have you with us today. After a number of CFD consultations over the last few months, covering various proposals to help maximise the scheme in support of the Clean Power 2030 target, we have now had the publication of the indicative timeline for AR7. To start us off then, what did the timeline tell us? And what are the key dates in the timeline for developers to be aware of?
I think
Who would like to start that one?
I'll give it a start, Tim. I think probably one of the interesting things it told us before going into the detail of the specific dates is that we know that there's going to be a distinction in how the non-offshore technologies are going to be handled or could potentially be handled in terms of the timelines versus the offshore technologies. So I believe this is the first time that we've ever seen separate indicative timelines published on a technology basis. And I think a lot of the conversation we've had is it's given us more certainty, but also there are still lots of different avenues that AR7 could pan out based on the types of appeals that we get and based on kind of that process. So the number of different dates that we are sort of keeping an eye out for that could be important is probably a bit wider. You know, there's probably more of those dates to be aware of this year. For Allocation Round 7. I know that Tim is very close. He's got a copy of the dates to hand, so can probably go through those. But we know that ultimately we probably won't be seeing anything in the way of results until probably around sort of December, I believe, at the earliest. But Tim, I'll let you go through the key sort of milestones.
Yeah, sure. My eyes will first be turning to July, because July is when we're going to see a lot more details about the AR7 auction itself. Particularly, we're going to get the publication of the allocation framework, and we're going to get the publication of the auction parameters, which will be quite exciting because the auction parameters will actually tell us, or hopefully tell us, how much capacity and how much the auction might cost in light of the stretching CP30 target. So it's the first glimpse as to the kind of ambitions and the approach that government is taking towards the auction. So very much looking forward to July. The next key date for developers will be the 7th of August, because that's the one where the application window opens. So developers are going to need to prepare all their documentation and make sure they have confirmed all the details about their site arrangements to be able to get ready for that application window. Unfortunately, it probably means that a lot of developers aren't getting a summer holiday this year, because they'll be preparing for their application in July and then writing their application into the EMR portal throughout the majority of August. Probably the next key date is probably 26th of September, because that's when you'll find out if you've actually qualified for the auction. And then for me, and I imagine for most developers as well, the sealed bid window is the other big date I look towards. As Lucy said, we can follow lots of different timelines, so we actually have no idea when the sealed bid window is going to be, depending on whether it follows the kind of short or long timeline. But it could require bids from developers as early as the 1st of October. But if we follow the later timelines, then you might not be required to put bids in until the start of December. So quite a big discrepancy there.
Right, so plenty to dive into. I think starting off then on those different scenarios that we have in the indicative timeline, do we have any indication of which one we might be most likely to see in both the non-offshore and offshore pathways?
Yeah, I think if we refer back to all the previous allocation rounds that we've seen, all of which have had sort of varying different scenario or timeline scenarios, from that shortest scenario of essentially no appeals taking place and everything, running as short as possible, all the way through to that 5th scenario, the longest timeline where there's the more extensive appeals process. I believe all of the past allocation rounds have operated at least on a longer timeline scenario. Probably most, if my memory serves correctly, have been on that longest timeline. So I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that it could well be on a longer timeline based on purely historical looking back to prior allocation rounds. And also we know that there has been change to allocation round 7 that could also make the process more complex, albeit kind of the process around the clean industry bonus is mostly wrapped up, but that's been a new introduction this year. So there's sort of plenty of other bits that we've seen that have come in that are new for allocation round 7. So that could impact that. Equally, it could also mean that because of some of those changes, it could potentially not go into that full level of appeal process based on some conversations that I was in fact having with Tim earlier that I think he can probably speak to in a bit more detail. I think my gut feel is that it will be a longer timeline scenario. As to exactly which one of those, there's still uncertainty there. So going back to that earlier point of, that indicative timeline for the two different sort of technology paths is going to be really important. People are going to probably want to have that bookmarked on their web browser to refer back to, because there's lots of different ones that we could see.
Yeah, going back to AR2, which is when I started working on the CFD. I don't remember a CFD round where we haven't followed the longest auction timeline. But the interesting thing for me in this one is that because they've separated the non-offshore wind technologies and offshore wind technology timelines, is that we might see the timelines diverge. And it was government's intention to try and run the offshore wind auction quicker than the non-offshore wind auctions. So if the handful of offshore wind applicants, because they're very large sites, don't see any appeals, we could see a scenario where we get the offshore wind auction running ahead of the non-offshore wind technology auction. That's very much me reading kind of between the lines and reading into government's intentions based on what they've said previously. Though I think that is a credible and possible outcome this year, but we do usually get quite a few appeals. So TBC on that one, Robin.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, just on that, while you have the timeline in front of you, when in that scenario might we expect to see the results of the allocation round published?
So quite a big variation in when we can expect to see the results being published. I think that we won't see the results until about 2 to 5 months behind what we observed for allocation round 6. And if I do look at the timings, we won't get the results until the earliest of November 2025 for non-offshore wind technologies, but we're more likely to see the results around the end of January for non-offshore wind technologies. And for offshore wind technologies, we're probably not going to see results until late December at the earliest, potentially late February at the latest. So as I mentioned, significantly behind the equivalent timelines of allocation round 6 there. So probably more likely to see 2026 for these results and contracts being distributed.
Yeah, that's really interesting and certainly different to what we've seen in previous allocation rounds, which Lucy, is something you touched on, is how AR7 is being run to a different timeline, but also kind of with different policies and regulation in place compared to some of the previous allocation rounds. So I wondered if you wanted to go into a bit more detail on some of those differences that we've seen, particularly compared to AR6.
Yeah, it's quite a long list. It's probably where I'd start with. I think to rattle off some of the things that we've seen, some of the suggested policy changes from government, we've seen points around relaxing the eligibility criteria for fixed foundation offshore wind. That, I would say, has been quite a divisive suggestion, noting the fact that there is this large pipeline of projects that might be just shy of the planning requirements to be able to enter the CFD, but also may potentially, it's lots of hypotheticals, but may potentially be able to progress should those sort of changes be made. But naturally, the other side of the coin is acknowledging the fact that there could be that risk of non-delivery of those sites as well. So an interesting kind of suggested change there around changing those criteria, but also seeing what that impact could be on competitive tensions within the CFD. There's been points around amending the budget process, so actually moving away from seeing the budget kind of prior to the allocation round really kicking off, but actually having that move towards this capacity ambition. So actually government saying this is how much we're wanting to secure. That's something that we've seen that's been new for this year. There's been changes suggested around extending the solar PV target commissioning window. So actually realising, government acknowledging the fact that we're seeing lots of larger scale solar sites sort of come through development through the CFD or otherwise. And so actually, is a 3-month target commissioning window appropriate for a much larger scale solar site versus sort of the smaller scale on a megawatt capacity basis of solar projects we've seen previously? Something that I think was really interesting when it was first proposed as well is around allowing repowered assets into the CFD. So government has kind of proceeded with its intention to enable that for onshore wind first. But also that, for me personally, is sort of personal interest, having lots of interest within the renewables obligation scheme as well, is an interesting piece of seeing how capacity could also be utilised based on existing generation that may be falling sort of outside its subsidy time horizons as well. And on a purely sort of much more administrative basis, but also something that I'm sort of quite glad to see be proposed by government, is moving reporting the prices from 2011, 2012 money, as it has been historically. And we often talk about it being a quirk of the scheme. You sort of have to look at CFD prices through a slightly different lens and acknowledge that it's not money of the day. But actually rebaselining that to 2024 money, it seems like a small thing, but I think actually in terms of broadening the understanding of the CFD and the cost of building new projects and generally making it easier to digest, CFD information much easier to digest in that way, was also sort of an interesting point. I've missed off many more, that there's lots to cover there. I'm sure Tim has probably got his own list of things that he was excited to see as well beyond those. So yeah, it's an exciting time. There's been lots of proposed changes and changes sort of taken forward. And now we just essentially have to wait and see what happens.
Yeah, certainly some interesting changes year on year, and we've seen them manifest in timeline. The two I'd probably pick up on is the change in the budget setting this year. Lots of our clients have been asking us, so if government's not setting a budget, well, how are they going to decide how much capacity is procured? So we can see that in the timeline in that government aren't actually going to set a budget until after the sealed bid window, which is after when applicants actually submit bid prices for their projects, which is a quite significant change. Instead, though, government have said that, as you said, Lucy, earlier in the session, is that government are looking to publish a capacity ambition. They haven't really committed to when they're going to publish that capacity ambition. They've just said we're going to publish more details about what this is going to look like in due course. I'm really hoping it comes out alongside the auction parameters in July. And that will give some clarity to the procurement levels that we might expect from AR7, which are supposed to be at historic levels if we're going to reach the CP30 targets.
So is it fair to say that at the moment, we're not sure how that capacity ambition is going to be set and what sort of figures and capacity we'll be looking at?
Yeah, I can start here, but I'm sure Lucy will jump in with her own figures. We've probably each got our own calculations that we've done. Correct. It's unclear right now the formal mechanism of setting those capacity ambitions, but you would think that they should be aligned to the CP30 targets, which are quite stretching. If I go off my very rough calculations, then that could mean that we could require up to around 11 gigawatts of solar PV in this auction, and in AR8, actually 11 gigawatts each. We could require around 4.5 gigawatts in each of AR7 and AR8 of onshore wind, and we could require around 7 to 10 gigawatts in each of AR7 and 8 of offshore wind, which is around 4 times the procurement levels, at least for onshore wind and solar, that we saw in allocation round 6. That does depend, though, how they set the capacity ambition, whether or not they spread that to AR9 as well, because they might actually spread some of that capacity to AR9, or they might suggest to the market that not all of this needs to be delivered through the CFD. So lots of ifs and buts still. I'd love to see them published in July.
Yeah, and I think when I was looking back through some of the wording around some of these updates, particularly around the capacity ambitions, it's the CP 2030 targets are a known entity. So it does mean that we can, as Tim has just sort of spoken through, can sort of preempt where these sort of expectations could land, but also the fact that government's been very clear in its messaging of the success of allocation round 7 will be measured by whether it ultimately secures the capacity needed for 2030. And I think when we look at things like delivery years as well, because that's also a very important metric when working out, yes, we need to know how much capacity we need to be developing and supporting through the CFD, but also we are somewhat beholden to the delivery years for those different technologies. And I think from my looking at it, allocation rounds 7 and 8 would just sort of fall within the 2030 timelines if we're looking back again at past delivery years for different technologies and the different technology pots. But also that does, there's a lot of risk riding on that, because that's also assuming, one, that the CFD is viable for those projects, which we all hope is the case, but also that those projects ultimately come to fruition. And we're still seeing, challenges in the development of projects. And so it's not just a case of ensuring that we secure that capacity first and foremost in allocation round 7. It's also making sure that those projects do ultimately deliver, and they deliver within, as I mentioned, those delivery years that fall within that timeline. So as you say, Tim, it's lots of uncertainties and ifs and buts at this point, but there's definitely potential for it. The scope is there. It's now just a case of seeing how those sort of auction parameters are set out, and how the capacity ambition is set out too.
Yeah, some really interesting stuff in there. And I think also probably worth pointing out at this point that we are still waiting on some of those consultation responses. So government has responded to some of the legislative proposals that were set out in the February consultation on changes to the CFD scheme. However, we are still waiting for some of those other proposals that both Lucy and Tim have already talked about as to whether they are actually going to be taken forward into AR7. Moving on slightly then, in terms of some of the changes, and just touching back on the pipeline, at the moment it's being published as indicative. So does that mean we expect this to change at all?
Yes, good question. So normally the indicative timeline for the CFD that's published is adhered to by government when it comes to kind of the final timeline. But there are some unique risks that I personally see to the indicative AR7 timeline at this stage. There's still quite a few hurdles government needs to overcome and responses to industry developments, such as the consultations you've just mentioned. But a couple of other ones that come to mind include the TNUoS cap and floor decision. So that's awaiting a decision from Ofgem, and they committed to making a decision for AR7 to give applicants some certainty on what their transmission network charges will be for deliver when they deliver under the CFD. And the other major one is government's committed to a REMA decision before allocation round 7. Now, that last one is a little bit vague to me because they've said they've committed to a REMA decision before, quote unquote, the auctions open. So that could either be before the application window, which opens on the 7th of August, or it could potentially be before we see the start of the auction itself, as in the sealed bid window, when participants are invited to bid. I'd like to think it's the former date, 7th of August, that we'd have a decision on REMA by, but we've seen obviously lots of delays to REMA, and there may be an excuse to delay that slightly further into the auction process if a decision hasn't been made by that time. So I think there's some risk to the timeline that's been published. Hopefully it'll be adhered to, though.
Yeah, I suppose it's that point, as you mentioned, with all the wider, we talk a lot about REMA, but as you mentioned, TNUoS reform, the CFD and the changes, they don't exist in a vacuum. There's everything else in the market happening around it. So it would, there's almost certainly an amount of risk around those timings.
And do we expect then that these kind of delayed timings or potential delayed timings, particularly in relation to previous allocation rounds, are then going to have a knock-on effect on timings for AR8 and beyond?
I think it's maybe slightly hard to tell at this stage, is perhaps my gut feel. Wanting to be an optimist, would say no, hopefully not. And I think certainly now that we've got this annual cadence of allocation rounds, that does give better sort of surety than we've maybe seen in the past when there was longer time between allocation rounds. But I don't know whether we've had, almost certainly we haven't had a situation where there's been an allocation round on a much longer timeline, while also knowing that the next one, as you acknowledge, would also be starting up within the timelines of this one finishing. So I'm not too sure personally. I don't know whether, Tim, you've heard anything through the consultancy grapevine, or you've got a hunch either way, but it could be the case that the next allocation round starts up while this one concludes. But again, could that then have knock-on impacts of timings of that allocation round? So there's much for government to consider of how that kind of operates. And also wouldn't want to, miss out on any potential learnings from allocation round 7, if that's still kind of in the results phase, shall we say, when the next allocation round starts off as well. So it probably could go either way, is maybe my thinking.
Yeah, the best question I've had is, will allocation round 8 happen at all? Which I certainly hope there's an AR8. I think we've had a consistent issue since we've had the introduction of annual allocation rounds, in that a couple of the allocation rounds have experienced delays, but they've adhered to starting the auction at least 12 months later. So we've kind of gone beyond an annual auction schedule now, and I don't think government have quite kept to a properly annual auction schedule. We know they're keen to try and make the timelines of these auctions a bit tighter and not as lengthy as they are currently. So I would like to think that we would see allocation round 8 open in August next year at the latest, and if not, potentially see some slightly squeezed timelines on the future auctions so that they can happen a bit more efficiently. That's maybe me being a little bit optimistic, but by that point, this government will hopefully be used to running an allocation round because it's their first full allocation round in government. They will know the process and the decisions that need to be made and the consultation changes that they expect to make. So I'd like to think that AR8 potentially will see maybe more efficient timings and hopefully keep on that annual schedule is my optimistic take.
Another one to keep an eye on then, but yeah, fingers crossed for an AR8 auction and allocation round happening next year. So I think that's everything I had to discuss, unless there's anything else either of you wanted to flag to the listeners.
There are a couple of very small, interesting things, probably just points of thought that maybe people on their journeys can go away and think about. One of which is there's overlap with the connections reform process, which we haven't mentioned today. I only mention that because yesterday the changes to the new connections process went live, so it's a bit of a milestone, and we finally got a timeline as well as to how that will roll out throughout 2025. It's going to be interesting to see how government overlays AR7 with the connections reform process and potentially even kind of impact the application or contracts themselves should applicants start to see their new connection offers issued or their connection dates even potentially changed after having made an application or winning a contract. So that's one to keep an eye out for. And the other small bit of extra insight I took away from the timeline is that I think that floating offshore wind might be given its own pot or even move into the offshore wind pot because it's been given its own timeline with offshore wind. So I cannot confirm or deny whether or not that is true, but I have a feeling that we might get floating offshore wind split out this year and some more specific government targets in the CFD for that technology. There's just a couple of concluding thoughts for you to walk away with.
And hopefully we'll find out in July on that pot structure. Lucy, any final thoughts from yourself?
No more from me. I think just knowing those technology pots is one of my personal favourite bits of the auction parameters until we get into the real weeds of the actual allocation round. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how those change. We've seen that they have changed in previous allocation rounds and they've been tweaked as the scheme has developed. So if it were to change for this allocation round, it would just be indicative, I suppose, of the wider development of the CFD. But yeah, one to keep an eye out for.
Certainly. Tim, Lucy, thank you very much for your time today. I think it's been a really interesting discussion and will, I'm sure, help to clear up some of those issues and changes developers might face ahead of AR7. If you're interested in finding out about any more of the topics we've discussed in today's podcast, then please do get in contact. Our CFD support service provides key analysis, support and information to help AR7 participants throughout the allocation round, delivered through our dedicated online portal. We also offer bespoke support to help developers navigate AR7 from pre-application activities to understanding the contracts themselves. Thank you all for listening to today's podcast. If you are interested in learning more about Cornwall Insight's analysis, training and consultancy services, please visit our website at www.cornwall-insight.com or get in touch with us by emailing inquiries@cornwall-insight.com. Thank you.